Welcome to Shelf Help, a channel dedicated to talking to the void about whatever book I happen to be reading. I am your host, the reader. The following review will contain spoilers. As my country continues to foxtrot with fascism, it seemed like a good time to continue my lighter reading. So how about a retelling of everyone's favorite socialist folk hero, Robin Hood? I've said before, I love reimaginings. Fairy tales and folklore are the essential tales of humanity. Despite culture or location, you see the same themes. And while Robin Hood is very British, the idea of an outlaw hero rising against the ruling power is nothing new. Spartacus, Jesse James, even Jesus falls under this. Robin Hood was probably not a singular person, though it's hard to say for sure. Robert, and its diminutive Robin, were fairly common names in the 13th century, and the surname Hood was fairly common as well. There's also the theory that Robin Hood was a default name given to felons, much like we use John Doe as a placeholder name. Regardless, this story has been told, and retold, and retold, and retold, and parodied, and retold again. In the early tellings, he was of the yeoman class. In the modern version, he's a noble who fought in the Crusades with King Richard the Lionheart and lost his land to the Sheriff of Nottingham and the usurper King John. There are some interesting currents of divine rights of king and one true king that still persist. In this retelling, Robin and most of his friends are fae or half-fae. The idea of Robin Hood, the trickster outlaw, as a member of the race that is infamous for playing pranks on humanity, has so much potential as a story. It would explain why he can hide and live in the king's forest undetected, how they slip seemingly from nowhere to rob from the rich and melt back into the trees, changing the forest paths to lose the sheriff, shape-changing to walk among the common people while leaving pilfered coins for the poor. So much potential. In this story, Robin is taking a back seat to Little John and Tuck. Which is okay. There's always interesting stories to be told about side characters. Little John is a green man, a forest guardian that aren't unlike the Ents of Lord of the Rings, though they are concerned with the whole forest and not just the trees. Tuck is part huntsman, though he's also still a monk. We'll get back to that. Together they are trying to take back Little John's lady love, Jane, from the clutches of Queen Mab. Jane tripped into a fairy trap as she fled an arranged marriage and, unbeknownst to her, has been a slave for the last 50 years. The only way to free her is with the help of a goddess of the crossroads who lives in a cup on the night of the equinox when the moons of the two planes align. The cup is currently in the possession of our main character, Nick. Nick is an orphan raised in Locksley Abbey, who is also part fae. The church is in crisis. King Richard is at war with the Pope, and all the abbots and abbotesses have been ejected from England, and worship has been strictly curtailed. People are beginning to return to the old ways and see the forest folk again. Nick has been raised in the confines of the church, but even at a young age, he could spot the forest folk in the trees and often gets in trouble for adding them to the decorative edges of the scripture copies. This story feels a bit like a series of folk tales, as Nick ventures from the abbey and learns about the world around him, helping the forest folks and human serfs hiding in Sherwood Forest. Nick finds the cup holding the crossword goddess, Elena. She begins teaching him about his heritage and magic, and how to sneak in and out of the abbey without being seen. It's worth noting that the conflict between Christian and pagan beliefs isn't a major theme of this story. It's touched on, but the forest folks and their gods seem to take the "we exist whether you believe in us or not" stance. Nick himself only feels flashes of concern for the juxtaposition of his life of Christian teachings and the goddess he carries in his pocket. Tuck has given up worrying about it entirely. Nick's a good kid, trying to help those around him win and as best he can, but he's not a very introspective character. As I said, this feels a bit like a series of folk stories stitched together, so none of the characters are really exploring their inner conflicts. This makes Nick rather dull. His story is set against the backdrop of a holy war, folklore heroes, and finding out he is part creature that should not exist. He takes everything in stride, which is fine, it's just not enough to carry the story. In this case, I think hanging Nick's story on the legend of Robin Hood hurts more than it helps, at least in the way it's used here. When you borrow folk heroes, they come with a certain amount of expectations. Robin Hood was an early incarnation of a superhero. He was from a noble birth, he fought in the Crusades, he often outwitted the evil sheriff and usurper King John. He gave to the poor, and despite being an outlaw, his charm and wit won him the affections of Maid Marian. In this story, he's there. The famous archery contest happens, but there's no robbing from the rich to help the poor, no dodging the sheriff, no romancing Maid Marian. And while these aren't strictly necessary, the aesthetic isn't even there. Robin is cursed by a warlock who's dead, and Marian is trapped in a cave outside of time. Robin seems depressed. He's part of the Sherwood community, but he's not doing more than just getting by with everyone else. Even if he had no larger role in the main plot, if he were just shown harassing the nobility, it would at least have a more Robin Hood feel. Nick isn't enough to overcome this. It's like he's trying to wedge himself into a Robin Hood type role, but he lacks the charisma to pull it off. I'm going to put this on my third shelf. It's fine, but it kind of gets in its own way. Robin Hood is a trickster folk hero. The Fae are a race that love to play tricks and pranks on humans. And there is no tricking going on here. Little John can step into a tree, Will Scarlet can turn into a bird. The idea that they can slip in and out of human reality should make for a great story, but it's never utilized. They just hide in the woods and bemoan their fate. Nick as a character just isn't strong enough to carry a story with the legend hanging over his head. This could have easily been a metaphor for growing up and self-discovery. The internal and external conflicts of Christian and pagan beliefs should have at least given him pause. The story isn't bad, it's just disappointing and doesn't live up to its potential. Thank you for your time. I know everyone's mileage will vary, so feel free to leave your thoughts.